So the first question asks you about either internal or external respiration. If you chose internal respiration, that's the exchange of oxygen and CO2, or just the exchange of gas between your blood and your cells. So internal respiration is the exchange between blood and cells. External respiration is the exchange of gas between your lungs and the environment. We could also just put your blood here, because as soon as the air comes into your lungs, it's transferred into your blood. Cellular respiration, of course, we know from previous units, that's the reaction where oxygen and glucose are used to produce CO2 and water and energy. Now, question number 2 asks, what is one of the 3 things your nasal sinuses do to the air that you breathe? So your choices are warm it up, moisten it or humidify it, and clean it. So your nasal sinuses make the air warmer, more humid or moister, and cleaner. What is your voice box called? It is called your larynx. And when you look at a picture of someone's trachea, there will be a bump in it, and the bump is where the larynx is. So if you're looking at an anatomical diagram, that's how you can identify it. Don't forget also that the trachea looks like it has little round rings all the way down it, and so that's how you could identify its presence. Your windpipe is your trachea, so that's the answer to number 4. Number 5 asks, if you were choking on a piece of food, which part of your respiratory system didn't do its job? And that is your epiglottis. That's the little flap of tissue at the top of your trachea. So if this is your neck, you have 2 tubes that run down your neck. You have your trachea, and you have your esophagus. And so there is a little piece of tissue that's supposed to cover your trachea so that food does not go down that tube. But remember, the pharynx is this common opening where food and air both pass through. 6 asks, which lung is larger? Why? It is your right lung, which on a picture would look like the left side, because you're always looking at a mirror image. And the reason it is larger is because your heart is on the left side, taking up some space. Yes, Samson. That would just be the top of your windpipe, so that would be partially right, but the actual pipe itself is called the trachea. Number 7, the sacs that increase the surface area of your lungs are called alveoli. Number 8, which muscle is below the lungs and causes you to breathe? It is your diaphragm. Now, number 9 is going to explain why the diaphragm is necessary for you to breathe. Anyone who was here yesterday, which was the vast majority of you, would have seen the fun little demonstration where you pull on the membrane at the bottom of the demonstration and the balloons inside inflated. Keep in mind that your lungs are not a muscle. Without the diaphragm and the other muscles that are in your thoracic cavity, you would not be able to breathe because your lungs are not muscles. They would not contract or expand on their own. Thanks. So number 9 is giving you a choice. In number 9, you either needed to describe inspiration or expiration, and it's because the steps are basically the same with one key change. So I will do inspiration first, what happens when you inhale. First step is that your muscles contract. The specific muscles are your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. Intercostal means between your ribs. The result of this muscle contraction is that the volume in your thoracic cavity increases. So muscle contraction pulls your diaphragm down, pulls your rib cage up and out. So there is increased volume. Gas laws tell us that if we increase volume, we automatically decrease pressure. Since air always flows from an area of high to low pressure, and we just reduced pressure in your lungs, air flows in because of the pressure change. Now, expiration or exhaling is the same 4 steps with a slight difference. In the first step, your muscles relax. In the second, volume decreases. In the third, pressure increases. And in the fourth, air goes out because now pressure is higher in the lungs than outside, and air always flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Would anybody like to ask any questions about any of the parts of this daily review? So number 9, we would give 4 points for because there were 4 steps. Number 6, we would give 2, and for all of the other questions, we would give 1. That means that this should be out of 13, if I'm not crazy. So on the screen, you have some terminology that has to do with the volume that is available in your lungs. And that's what the lab activity we're going to do today is about as well. For each of the volumes that you have a description of there, you would also need to be able to recognize it on a diagram. So in your textbook, page 250 has a diagram that shows this same idea. It's not identical to this, but it's the same basic principle. The way that you would get these volumes is by hooking yourself up to a machine called a spirograph. And it would give you this printout showing how much air came in and out of your lungs every time you breathe. So the first terminology word is tidal volume. This is the volume of air that is inhaled and then exhaled every time you take a normal-sized breath. Now, normal is not a very precise word, but what we mean by normal is the breathing you do without thinking about it. So when your brain is controlling your breathing and you're not consciously thinking about breathing, that is what a normal breath really is. You can force yourself to breathe more deeply or more shallowly, but when everything is normal and everything is on autopilot, that is what a normal breath is. Now, on the picture that's in your textbook, there are some numbers associated with it, and I'm going to use the same numbers as the textbook does so that it can be comparable. In your textbook, then, it says that these 2 lines would be 2,400 and 2,900 milliliters. We generally measure the amount of air that can come in and out in milliliters. Liters are kind of too big, and anything smaller than a milliliter would end up being too small. So milliliters are what's represented. And in your textbook or on this picture, we're going to say that this line here and this line here represent 2,400 and 2,900 milliliters. That means that the space between them is 500 milliliters. And that is pretty typical for a normal breath. So for an average person, the amount of air that goes in and then comes out on a normal breath is 500 milliliters. Now, of course, this could be higher or lower depending on your age, your size, your health in general, and on activities that you perform that might increase the amount of air that you can take in and push out of your lungs. But that is a pretty typical volume. Tidal volume on a diagram is going to look like a continuous up and down stream. And it will usually be right in the middle of the diagram because that is what happens normally. Your inspiratory reserve volume is the extra, and that is a really key word, the extra air that can possibly be inhaled after a normal breath. So notice here in my diagram and in the diagram in your textbook, the inspiratory reserve volume starts where your tidal volume ends. So this is extra space in your lungs that could be used if you need to. This is when you take a really, really, really deep breath in. On the diagram that is in your textbook, this line here is just below 6,000, so we're going to say that it's 5,900 milliliters, give or take. And so if we were to give a value to this volume, in this particular person, it's 3,000 milliliters. Now, the inspiratory reserve volume can have a lot of variation in it. And so if your inspiratory reserve volume is not 3,000 milliliters, don't be alarmed. You are not dying. This is just the number that's in the diagram we're looking at, but it could be much smaller than that. It could also be larger than that. Now, if I were to take those two things together, tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume, that's how I would calculate the total air that I can possibly breathe in. So neither of these things is the total amount of air you can breathe in. One of them is the amount you breathe in normally. The other is the amount that you breathe in after a normal breath. Together, if I were to add them up, that's the total amount of air that you can breathe in. Now, expiratory reserve volume is the same principle, extra air, so it's not including your tidal volume. It only starts, if we look, after your tidal volume has ended. Now, expiratory reserve volume is usually smaller than inspiratory reserve volume. If we look at the diagram, this line down here in your textbook is 1,200 milliliters, or very close to it. So that means that this person's expiratory reserve volume is only 1,200 milliliters. Now we'll talk about why expiratory reserve volume is smaller in just a second. But if I wanted to know all of the air that a person could breathe in and out, I would call it vital capacity. To find that out, I add up tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, and expiratory reserve. So on the diagram, it's this red line over here that goes from the top of the expiratory or the inspiratory reserve line to the very bottom of the expiratory reserve line. Now that's not all of the air in your lungs. And the way that your textbook words it is a little, I don't like it. In your textbook, it says that vital capacity is total lung volume, and that just simply is not the best way to word it. Vital capacity is all of the air that you personally can cause to enter and exit your lungs. But that's not all of the air that there is. There is what's called the reserve volume, or sometimes it's called the residual volume. It is the air that is left in your lungs after the expiratory reserve volume. So down here, there's a little bit of space on the spirograph where no actual line would be. And that's because there is air left in your lungs that you cannot exhale. Does anyone know why you need that? So the reason that you need this residual air is to prevent the collapse of your lungs. If there was no air left in your lungs are like a wet, sticky balloon. Try prying apart two sides of a wet balloon that's been deflated. It's very hard. And so if your lungs, the sides were to touch each other, it would be very hard to inflate them again. So you need to have a little bit of air left in your lungs, sort of like a little cushion, a buffer, so that the tissue of your lungs does not start sticking to itself, so that it can stay inflated and you can continue breathing. So if there was no residual volume, your lung would collapse. That means that your total lung capacity every bit of air that exists in your lungs, whether or not you can inhale and exhale it or whether or not it stays there all the time, is where I add up your vital capacity and your reserve volume. So vital capacity is everything that you can control. We add the reserve volume, and that gives us total lung capacity. On this spirograph, you'll see then that the reserve volume was about 1,200 milliliters. Notice that that's more or less the same as the expiratory reserve volume, and that would be pretty typical. It would not be possible for you to measure the residual volume in your lungs with the tools that we're going to use today. To be able to measure the residual volume, you have to know how much air is left in your lungs after you breathe, and the tests that we're going to perform only work if you're actually breathing. So you cannot measure your reserve volume with a spirograph. We know that it would be there underneath what we're measuring, but we wouldn't get an accurate value for it. And I'm mentioning that because one of the questions in your lab is going to ask you about that. Now, this person's total lung volume is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 milliliters. That's actually pretty high. A typical person your age and your size might have a total lung volume closer to 4 liters instead of 6 liters. And I'd just like you to recognize that 6,000 milliliters is 6 liters. There are 1,000 milliliters in a liter. And so if we were to say 6 liters, we are saying the same thing as 6,000 milliliters.